Welcome everyone to the KSAC Webinar Series. Today we are going to be talking about the neurobiology of trauma, and this is geared more towards grades 11 through 12. We're just going to briefly introduce the facilitators that are here today before we jump on in. So my name is Alicia Fisher. I'm the Prevention Education Supervisor with the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center, and we have Lucas.
Hi everyone, my name is Lucas Schaefer, and I'm the Mending Program Coordinator at the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center. Courtney, you're up next.
Hello, my name is Courtney, and I am a placement student at Kawartha Sexual Assault Center. I am a student at Fleming College in the Mental Health and Addiction and Social Service program. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Awesome. Let's get this launched. There we go. Okay, great. So today we're going to be talking about the neurobiology of trauma. So we're going to briefly talk about who the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center is. We're going to go into what is trauma, the main parts of the brain. We're going to talk about the brain and trauma, survival mode, triggers, why they happen, and then wrap everything on up. So briefly about the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center. So we are located in Peterborough. We serve the counties of Peterborough, Kawartha Lakes, or City of Kawartha Lakes, Haliburton, and Northumberland. We support individuals of all gender identities who are impacted by sexual and gender-based violence. We offer individual and group counseling opportunities, and these group counseling opportunities can be anything from expressive arts, journaling, all the way through psychoeducational programs like about how trauma impacts the brain. And we also offer support for their supporters as well. We do accompaniment, advocacy, and peer support. So if you are accessing certain victim services, such as court services, maybe reporting to police, navigating the criminal justice system, or even going to the hospital, you can contact one of the members at KSAC, and we can provide that accompaniment support. On the other side, we also have public education and prevention education. We talk to all folks, elementary school through high school, college, university, about a variety of topics surrounding sexual violence, consent, healthy relationships. We also offer a 24/7 crisis line via text, phone, as well as online, which you can access through our website, kawarthasexualassaultcenter.com. We will show more information about those services at the end of the presentation. But we also have our mending program. Maybe Lucas, you can briefly talk about that.
Thanks so much, Alicia. So a part of the public and prevention education side of things at KSAC, we have the Mending Program, which is a male ally leadership program that seeks to engage men in ending gender-based violence. And how we do that in the program is talk about what gender-based violence is and what it looks like in our society. We talk about what it means to be a man and what are some of the stories that we're told about what being a man is and how does that relate to gender-based violence. We also talk about what consent is and what healthy relationships look like. And then we start talking about how we can apply that knowledge that we have into the experiences where we witness gender-based violence in our everyday lives. So learning about bystander intervention and how to be an active intervener. And then at the end of the program, we allow the participants to continue their learning by facilitating the program and going out into webinars, talking about these awesome topics that they've learned.
Okay, great. So let's get into it here. So we're starting off first by talking about trauma. So I kind of have here, trauma does not have to equal trauma. Maybe Courtney, you can go into talking about this and reading the first couple points here.
Yeah, sure. So a traumatic event can involve a single experience or enduring repeated events that completely overwhelm the individual's ability to cope or integrate the ideas and emotions involved in that experience. So I think it's important to note that with trauma, something that is traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to another person, and vice versa. Something that isn't traumatic to somebody can be traumatic for you. It can be range in different, sizes. It can be something small that happens for a minute, or it can be something that goes on over multiple years. So people often report feeling trapped and helpless during the time of the trauma and can sometimes feel overwhelmed and unable to cope, not only in the immediate aftermath, but often for a long time afterwards. For some people, symptoms emerge or reemerge later in life in response to other stressors. So it's important to note again that the traumatic event itself is hard, but following the traumatic event, there are lots of different ways that our body deals with that trauma, and it can show itself in ways that we act and the ways that our body functions. So, and it looks different for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. We also have a webinar that talks about the prevalence of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and gender-based violence. And so that goes into more detail about how prevalent trauma is, especially when it's connected to sexual events in nature, or even with relationships, right? So trauma is something that is extremely prevalent, and we have to think about that. Our brain's main goal is to survive through these things, but sometimes our brain doesn't really help. Sometimes it creates kind of a hindrance. So as we move into the brain, we're going to kind of talk about the three main parts of the brain. So, sorry, I'm just going to shift this over here. So when we look at the brain, we look at what essentially is developing first, and we're going to work our way out to what is developed last in utero, right? So when we look at the oldest part of the brain, a lot of people will consider this the reptilian part of the brain. So that's kind of the lower part where it's like the brain stem, and the brain stem. So essentially it controls those very automatic responses of survival. It also regulates your body, right? So we don't have to think about keeping our heart rate going. We don't have to think about the blood flowing through our bodies. The brainstem is something that is responsible for all of that, as well as all of the neuroreceptors and signals that are coming from our brain and going through our body. Everything passes through the brainstem. So that's kind of the initial one, and it's very much responsible for those automatic responses in our lives. Then we move to the limbic system. So this is kind of the midbrain area. And so there's a couple main parts here that are really integrated with trauma. So that is like the amygdala. And so this is kind of like the smoke detector of being like, beep, beep, beep. Okay, there's something dangerous. There's trauma happening, and I need to signal the rest of the body. So it connects to the higher function part of the brains and the lower function part of the brains. So by higher and lower function, I mean ones that require more cognitive thinking and thought versus the ones that are just automatic. The mid part of the brain here, the limbic system, is also responsible for memory, expression, and emotion. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Lucas, do you want to go into the neocortex, the higher level part? Yeah.
Thanks so much, Alicia. So the neocortex is the last part of the brain that develops, and it allows the person to reflect. It's this kind of higher function, like Alicia was talking about before, and this kind of deliberative part of your brain, right? It's where like decision making happens and thinking happens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you remember the lobes of the brain, Lucas?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Like there's temporal, parietal, occipital. Like there's a lot of.
There's one more.
Oh, prefrontal cortex?
Yeah, frontal. Yep, you got it. Wow, look at you.
Trent, you graduate.
Okay. All right. So now we know like the entirety and the three main sections of the brain. Let's talk about where trauma actually interacts in the brain. So there are four main areas of the brain that are affected by trauma. So we look at the hippocampus. So again, this is within the limbic system. It's the kind of bluish one right here. So again, sitting right in the middle, right on top of that brain stem, kind of connecting the higher level and lower level thinking, right? So we've got the brainstem in there. We've got the amygdala, again, that kind of like emergency flashing light. There's the amygdala. We got that prefrontal cortex, and then of course the brainstem down below. So let's discuss those in a little bit more detail. So the prefrontal cortex, this is kind of something that a lot of our thoughts, a lot of our interactions, how we're going to react to things, passes through our mind. And by react to things, I don't mean the automatic reaction. I mean like how we think about a reaction and then have the reaction. So this is the prefrontal cortex. This is very different than an automatic response. So again, this is for that higher level reasoning, that problem solving. It sits right behind the frontal lobe. The thing with the prefrontal cortex is that it can't work without an abundance of oxygen, right? So we need to keep breathing in order to be thinking properly. So when the amygdala identifies danger, it activates our survival systems, resulting in an elevated heart rate, rapid and shallow breathing. All non-essential body functions will be delayed. So digestion, ovulation, and that's also including memory, right? So that amygdala is kind of like acting like a barrier in a way from that higher level thinking of the brain versus those automatic responses, right? So when we hear a fire alarm, we do not need to sit there and think like, oh, should I react to that? Like, no, your brain is automatically going to go, okay, bam. Do I see any fire? Is there anything around? It's kind of that immediate sit up and pay attention response, right? So that is your amygdala and your hippocampus going, hello, we're doing something. That is not your prefrontal cortex. So all that kind of higher level order and functioning shuts down because we don't need that to survive. Certainly there's times when you're able to think about your actions, but when it comes to survival, you need an immediate response, and your brain is what is going to turn off that higher level thinking and turn on those automatic responses. So that means when the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, that means that they work in tandem with each other, right? The amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. But survival, as we were saying, will always trump that higher level reasoning. Courtney, did you have anything to add to this?
I think like in terms that I understand too, like the fight, flight, or freeze, right? Like that's our immediate reaction. So that would be, you know, your amygdala like telling you like this is what's going on, and there you go. Yeah, everybody reacts differently, right? So it's coming up. We'll get more into that, I guess, but that's what I think of when I think of immediate reaction, right? You don't control if you freeze. Your body just does it.
Mm-hmm. Lucas, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, just like emphasizing how there's different kinds of cognition, right? Like every time we've been talking about higher order and lower order, right? And that the prefrontal cortex controls this higher order thinking, this deliberative thing that, as Courtney was alluding to, we have a lot more like agency and control over. But with these lower levels of thinking that are based around survival, it's something that kind of just overwhelms us, right? Like that was something that was mentioned earlier when we were talking about trauma. It floods the brain and influence us to respond in the ways that we're going to be talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this higher level order of thinking, it's kind of our cerebral cortex. It's where all of our lobes are. And so that's like the decision making, planning, reasoning. That's kind of the main kind of what you would expect to think about when you think about a brain. But then once we move into this limbic system, that's when we get into the thalamus, hippocampus, with memory and stuff like that. But of course, that amygdala is what's kind of regulating all of that right away. And so this kind of just lays out a couple other things in here, but our brainstem is that one that ensures survival, right? So as I said, those things that we don't have to think about. We don't have to think about breathing. We don't have to think about our heartbeat. We don't have to think about digestion. This is something that automatically happens when we experience trauma. And then, of course, when we think about the brain, you know, Courtney was mentioning it, that freeze, flight, fight, and fawn response, that all comes from the amygdala. That little part in our brain goes beep, 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 danger, danger, danger. And so we are now going to go into those responses of survival mode. So Courtney, maybe do you want to read the write-up that's here?
Yeah, sure. So our survival mode responses, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. They're the stress responses or trauma responses. So these are ways that the body automatically, without thought, reacts to stress and danger, controlled by your brain's automatic nervous system, which is a part of the limbic system. So the sorry, my camera's in the way there. The fight response there. So that would be irritability, anger, aggression, moving towards. So something happens and you get into your fight response. This is, you know, our body's way back in the caveman days when, you know, we had to fight for survival. That is what was put into our brains. So that's when we would get, you know, really high heart rate, muscles, you know, all that kind of stuff. Flight response. So this is anxiety and fear, panic, avoiding, chronic worrying, and perfectionism. So this would be avoid the situation. Something happens, a bear comes out of the cave and we run away, kind of thing, right?
The peace out response.
Yeah. So freeze is stuckness, collapse, immobilization, spacing out, dissociation, depression, and shame. So this is the freeze. Our body just kind of shuts down. We're dissociating, we're thinking of something else, maybe or no thoughts going through our head. Our body is just kind of freezing over to protect us from what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah, and with freeze, we actually see freeze in a lot of childhood sexual abuse cases where the child will just kind of freeze because they don't know what to do. And with a lot of childhood sexual abuse cases, these are typically people that are known to the individual. And so their brain is just trying to figure out, this is someone who's supposed to protect me, but it's someone that's currently harming me. And so fighting an adult back as a child, that's not going to give you the best response because this person's bigger than you and stronger than you. And similarly with flight as well, right? If a young child tries to run away, it takes maybe 2 or 3 steps for an adult to grab that child. And so that freeze is a very typical response that we see, especially with childhood sexual trauma. And then the last one, we tend to not really think about too much, right? We tend to hear like freeze, flight, fight, and that tends to be it. But maybe Lucas, you can go into the fawn response.
Thanks, Alicia. Yeah, so this is the kind of lesser known like instinctual or survival response that Alicia was talking about. And the reason why I think it's lesser known is because it's really complicated, right? So what fawning looks like as a survival response is people pleasing, avoiding conflict, prioritizing others' needs over your own, and having a difficulty like setting boundaries, right? And having a difficult time saying no because it's easier to say yes, right? So in these cases, maybe like in childhood sexual abuse cases, like Alicia was alluding to, it's easier to avoid harm by showing the person who's perpetrating harm against you love, right? And being nice towards them. So that's the kind of response.
It's more so with like domestic and intimate partner violence. The childhood sexual one is definitely more of the freeze. But for the fawn, like we hear so many people say like, well, why did she stay? Why didn't she go? If they were involved in a bad relationship, why did you stay? And it's that constant fear of threat in the back of your mind of, if I fight back, if I run away, and if I freeze and don't do anything, the harm that's happening to me can escalate, it can get worse, and it can lead to, really horrific things, right? Mm-hmm. And so that loving response is a survival thing. It's a way to keep you alive, to say, oh, okay, yep, that's okay, that's fine, oh, it's all right, you're just angry, it's okay, like I'm here for you. That is going to lessen and de-escalate a situation and protect and potentially save your life. It's then that connection that your brain starts to make of, okay, here's this person, I need to love them, I need to comfort them, I need to make sure that they don't get angry and then harm me, right? It's about that trying to kind of de-escalate a situation with that kind of fawning response. Courtney, did you have anything to add to those?
No, I think you covered that really well, yeah.
Okay, cool. So one of the things that comes up, and obviously this is a very superficial kind of conversation around trauma, and we could have had a 3-hour conversation about trauma in of itself, but something that comes up around trauma and how that impacts the brain are triggers, and how there may not be a danger or any kind of like harmful situation happening, but there's this thing called triggers that keep coming up for the individual. So we hear things like trigger warnings. Someone, you might get triggered. And so there's actually a cognitive reason for all of this. Maybe Courtney, you can read the first 2 points there.
Yeah, so a trigger in psychology is a stimulus such as a smell, sound, or sight that triggers feelings of trauma. So a trigger is a reminder of a past trauma, which includes sadness, anxiety, panic, or flashbacks. One of the functions neglected during a fight-flight situation is short-term memory formation. So remember earlier when we were talking about how when the amygdala signals and we go into that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, our memory can be turned
Very
off almost, right? So that can have an effect of us looking back and maybe not remembering the whole trauma situation, the whole, you know, everything about it. We could completely forget it. We could, forget points of it. And that's actually a really common brain function that a lot of people don't know about. So, in some cases, a person's brain may misfile the traumatic event in its memory storage. Rather than being stored as a past event, the situation is labeled as a still present threat. And when the person is reminded of the trauma, their body acts as if the event is happening. So return to that fight or flight mode. So that would be a trigger. So let's say somebody smells soup, and that is something that their brain had associated with the traumatic event. It's like that traumatic event is happening all over again. So their amygdala again signals you're in danger. Freeze, flight. It'll act as if that traumatic event is happening again.
Yeah. So it's like if you are in a domestically violent situation, let's just say you're home cooking lunch and you're making that soup. And then that's when your aggressive partner comes through the door and incites harm on you. That your brain has shut off this very like high level thinking, but those more automatic things of like smelling, those sensory receptions are still present. So you may not remember like what exactly the time was, or if the sun was up, if it was sunny or rainy, but you will remember that smell, and you remember what is happening within your body as opposed to what's happening externally around your body. So that smell of soup is something you experienced when you experienced trauma. And now you smell that soup a little bit later on, and all of a sudden your brain goes back to that as the beep, 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 beep response, right? Mm-hmm. And so that is those cognitive connections that, our brain is trying to keep us alive, but sometimes it gets a little annoying. Lucas, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, like I just think like, and while we're talking about something that affects like a lot of people, right? I find it so interesting, right? The ways in which trauma like affects memory formation in a way that like past events can feel like present ones. I just feel like that's very interesting, right? Like that we can through a process of like almost like being triggered and then reliving a past traumatic experience, like. Yeah, so I think that what that tells me is that we need to be really respectful when like people are becoming like activated or triggered, and this alarm bell goes off in them, because like living through a traumatic experience once is awful, but living that over and over and over again, like that's a lot. So what that tells me is that this is something that we should take really seriously and respect.
Yeah. And that it's not a joke or something to joke about, right? This is a cognitive functioning of your brain. 100%. Now we're going to watch a video kind of like outlining all of that. It does have a really thick kind of Scottish accent. Not sure why, but it's still a really great video that kind of brings all of this together.
We need to take a statement so we can establish what happened on Saturday night.
What time did you get back to David's flat?
What time? I don't know.
Can you give us an estimate?
I don't remember.
Would your pals remember what time you left the club?
He seemed nice.
She didn't remember much, did she?
I know. And now we've got to waste more time on a daft lecture. We know how to deal with victims. We've had years of experience.
Well, some of us have had more years than others.
I'm in my prime, I'll have you know.
That'll be right.
Today's session is about trauma. The latest in brain science will help you in your work. I'll start with a tour of the parts of the human brain. The reptilian brain maintains basic bodily functions. The limbic system is also instinctive. It deals with fear and pleasure. For example, you pat a dog, It senses pleasure and without thinking wags its tail. The neocortex is the site of logic, imagination, planning and control. It's more sophisticated, but because it's conscious, it's slower than the older parts of the brain. The amygdala is a key part of the limbic system. It has one job: to sense danger and set off the alarm. When it's a matter of survival, the primitive parts of the brain override the conscious part. There are 3 possible survival responses: fight, flight, or the one that people don't think of, freeze. When the alarm goes off, blood and oxygen are diverted to muscles, adrenaline floods the body, and all systems that are not crucial to survival are switched off. Normally, the job of the hippocampus is to file memories so you can retrieve them later. But in times of danger, it stops filing memories, which makes it harder to gather evidence later on. Instead, the hippocampus switches to pumping cortisol. What's useful about cortisol is it stops us feeling pain, so we can focus on survival. Can anyone give me an example?
A farming accident where a man carried his own arm for a mile without feeling any pain?
Yes, excellent example. It is an evolutionary safety mechanism which is fast and instinctive. In essence, it's our body's very clever way of protecting us. To recap, an example of the 3 parts of the brain working together. You're standing at a bar. Your reptilian brain is keeping your heart beating. You're enjoying the pleasure of a nice pint with your limbic system. You're using your neocortex to work out if there's time for another before the last train. What could happen to make the amygdala kick in? What if this happened? The way you'd respond would depend not on your logical brain, but on your instinctive brain. Being glassed in a bar would be a traumatic experience. Who can give me another example of an event that can cause trauma?
War?
Rape?
A car crash?
Good, yes. Trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed by something beyond their control. The survival brain takes over the rational brain. It can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with symptoms that last at least a month. Vicarious or secondary trauma is something you may experience if you deal with incidents such as rape or sudden death, or think of Lockerbie, Dunblane. You're not superheroes. Having a brain makes you all vulnerable to secondary trauma. It's important to understand that when trauma occurs again and again, it can become complex PTSD, such as in domestic abuse or child sexual abuse. The alarm system in the brain becomes jammed. Memories are stuck in the limbic system, so a trigger can set off the alarm. The trigger could be anything: a colour, a smell, a sound, a sensation. Now, the indicators of trauma. What should you be looking out for?
Depression. Crying a lot?
Yes, that's one response. And at the other end of the spectrum, total numbness.
Nightmares? Flashbacks?
Stress.
Good, yes. And they may feel sick. Also, shame, feelings of guilt, inability to enjoy sex, social isolation, triggers. People often feel overwhelmed by the symptoms of trauma. This can lead to using alcohol or other drugs to block out memories, or self-harm, or dissociation when a person's mind detaches from reality. Indicators can be specific to the type of trauma. Say, dental problems, when someone who was orally abused avoids going to the dentist. A victim of abuse might bond strongly to her abuser. This is known as traumatic bonding, or Stockholm syndrome. And jumbled up memory, when a person's normal recording of memories doesn't work. Can you recall any times you've seen that symptom?
What time? I don't know.
A traumatized person may not seem like her usual self, or may be hypervigilant, on edge, or being startled by everyday things. Everyone is different. You never know what impact trauma will have. Symptoms can change from day to day. So what does all this mean in practice, in your job? A traumatized person's brain is protecting them, but that normal human response of self-protection can get in the way of evidence gathering. The US military has developed new trauma-informed interviewing techniques that you can use to work around this. Research shows that if someone seems vacant, they could be distracted by their traumatic memories. Try to ground them by asking a simple, non-patronizing question such as, "Are you thirsty? Do you want a glass of water?" This can help bring them back to the here and now. Don't expect a logical, linear story. Ask, "What can you recall just now?" Find out what the victim physically felt or saw. Working this way, from the instinctive sensory parts towards the logical parts of the brain, you'll get more results. In conclusion, 4 things for you to take away. Trauma response is the brain in survival mode. Repeated abuse can make trauma symptoms worse. In response to trauma, people will behave in unexpected ways. Remember, trauma is a normal human response to abnormal events.
Okay, so to wrap up here, what did we learn? Maybe Lucas, do you want to take away the first 2 points there?
Absolutely. We learned that trauma can be a single event or multiple enduring events and repeated events. So this can either be something that happens once or something that you are constantly reliving and still experiencing trauma from. And we also learned that our reactions to trauma resides in our brain, and that it's mostly composed of lower level thinking like amygdala and our limbic system, as well as our brainstem. And that during those kind of survival mode moments, our higher order function is limited, right? We're not worrying about like making decisions or focusing on what we can control. We're kind of just, we're overwhelmed, and our body kind of almost takes over in a sense.
Yeah, for sure. Courtney, do you want to go with the last 3 there?
Yeah, so the hippocampus, amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and the brainstem are all the key brain factors or brain reactors, to trauma. So as Lucas was saying, like the lower brain, the survival mode, freeze, flight, fight, and fawn. You'll notice in the video there, they didn't include fawn. I believe it's more of a more recent addition to the, it used to be the 3 Fs. So now it would be the 4. They're involuntary. So it's not something that you sit there and, you think about, oh, do I want to run away? Do I want to fight this person? Do I want to freeze or show them love? This is something that your brain takes control over. You don't choose it, it just happens. And then triggers are connected to trauma. So again, as we talked about, traumatic events, smell, taste, touch, somebody can brush your shoulder and it can remind you of something, right? So anything can be a trigger, anything can be a traumatic event, and it's important to take somebody seriously if they say that they're triggered.
Definitely. Thank you so much. So if you are an educator, we would always appreciate if you would fill out the survey that is connected with the schedule that was sent out in the email. Any and all feedback is important. So with the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center, we do have 3 lines of 24/7 crisis support that is free, confidential, and immediate. Whether that be through our phone, a text line, or our online web chats, you can head on over to kawarthasexualassaultcenter.com to get connected to those supports, as well as our services and our social medias. So I want to thank you all for tuning in. I also want to thank Lucas and Courtney for being really awesome co-facilitators.
This was awesome. I'm familiar with like some elements of psychology and trauma, but I'll tell you very honestly, I learned a lot from this presentation and also from you all. So thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. It's always a fun time talking about the brain. Thanks, guys.
Thank you everyone so much.
Bye.
Take care.